And the men of Israel had been hard pressed that day. So Saul had laid an oath on the people, saying, "Cursed be the man who eats food until it is evening, and I am avenged on my enemies." So none of the people had tasted food. Now when all the people came to the forest, behold, there was honey on the ground. And when the people entered the forest, behold, the honey was dropping. But no one put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard his father charge the people with the oath. So he put out the tip of his staff that was in his hand and dipped it in the honeycomb and put his hand to his mouth, and his eyes became bright. Then one of the people said, "Your father strictly charged the people with an oath, saying, 'Cursed be the man who eats food this day.' And the people were faint." Then Jonathan said, "My father has troubled the land. See how my eyes have become bright because I tasted a little of this honey? How much better if the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies that they found. For now the defeat among the Philistines has not been great." They struck down the Philistines that day from Michmash to Aijalon, and the people were very faint. The people pounced on the spoil and took sheep and oxen and calves and slaughtered them on the ground, and the people ate them with the blood. Then they told Saul, "Behold, the people are sinning against the Lord by eating with the blood." And he said, "You have dealt treacherously. Roll a great stone to me here." And Saul said, "Disperse yourselves among the people and say to them, let every man bring his ox or his sheep and slaughter them here and eat, and do not sin against the Lord by eating with the blood." So every one of the people brought his ox with him that night, and they slaughtered them there. And Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first altar that he built to the Lord. Then Saul said, "Let us go down after the Philistines by night and plunder them until the morning light. Let us not leave a man of them." And they said, "Do whatever seems good to you." But the priest said, "Let us draw near to God here." And Saul inquired of God, "Shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you give them into the hand of Israel?" But he did not answer him that day. And Saul said, "Come here, all you leaders of the people, and know and see how this sin has arisen today. For as the Lord lives who saves Israel, though it be in Jonathan my son, he shall surely die." But there was not a man among all the people who answered him. Then he said to all Israel, "You shall be on one side, and I and Jonathan my son will be on the other side." And the people said to Saul, "Do what seems good to you." Therefore Saul said, "O Lord God of Israel, why have you not answered your servant this day? If this guilt is in me or in Jonathan my son, O Lord God of Israel, give Urim. But if this guilt is in your people Israel, give Thummim." And Jonathan and Saul were taken, but the people escaped. Then Saul said, "Cast the lot between me and my son Jonathan." And Jonathan was taken. Then Saul said to Jonathan, "Tell me, what have you done?" And Jonathan told him, "I tasted a little honey with the tip of the staff that was in my hand. Here I am. I will die." And Saul said, "God do so to me, and more also. You shall surely die, Jonathan." Then the people said to Saul, Shall Jonathan die who has worked this great salvation in Israel? Far from it. As the Lord lives, there shall not be one hair of his head fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day." So the people ransomed Jonathan, so that he did not die. Then Saul went up from pursuing the Philistines, and the Philistines went to their own place. May the Lord bless his people through the reading of his word. The title for this evening's sermon is, "When the man with the job is not the man for the job." When the man with the job is not the man for the job. And so we have 3 points this evening. We have the vow, the consequences, and the contrast. The vow, the consequences, and the contrast. Let's start out in our first point, and we'll get a little bit of introduction and review in this first point. Last week, if you recall, in chapter 14, we got up to verse 23 in the text, and we left off on a very happy note last time. Through the faith of Jonathan, the son of Saul, along with his armor bearer, God saved Israel from the Philistine army. God used only two men to bring deliverance to his people. More so than he had done with even the 300, right? The 300 people with Gideon that we looked at last week in Judges. God had delivered from the people of Midian. The people of Israel were delivered from the people of Midian with just 300. But here, the people of Israel are delivered with 2 men from the Philistines. While Saul, if you remember, was idly sitting in a cave, God was moving actively through Jonathan for the salvation of his people. Think of the contrast this paints. We're going to be thinking about this contrast more toward the end of the sermon but we have to think to ourselves this contrast between Jonathan and this contrast between Saul. Remember Saul idly sitting in the cave. He's there and he's with Ahijah the priest from the cursed family of Eli because Samuel has left. The word of the Lord spoken through the prophet Samuel has now left Saul in his disobedience, right? Because he offered to the Lord before Samuel had arrived. He did not wait for Samuel to arrive, but in his haste offered to the Lord. He disobeyed God. The prophet left, and now we see him idly sitting in the cave. But in contrast, Jonathan believes that the Lord may indeed, if you look back in chapter 14, verse 6, it may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few. He knows the power of the Lord. God can't be hindered from saving. If he wants to save, he'll save. It doesn't matter if it's by a great number of soldiers or very few. And he proves that this day by using simply 2 men, Jonathan and his armor bearer. But as we look and see more contrast between Jonathan and Saul, I want you to also think about the contrast between Saul and Yahweh. If you remember, the people wanted a king to be like the nations that surrounded them. They wanted that, and what we discussed weeks and weeks ago was the fact that they wanted this not because it was wrong for them to have a king, a human king. That wasn't wrong. There were provisions for that in Deuteronomy. We saw that. But it was a rejection of God himself. Their hope was going to be in a human king. That's what they were placing their hope in. They were not placing their hope in God. They were placing their hope in a human king. And that's why God says, you rejected me. And so, we see here failure after failure for Saul. And God is showing them, here is your king. Here's what you asked for. You rejected me. And so here is what you get. This unfaithful leader. But Yahweh, in contrast, has never been unfaithful to his people. He is a covenant-keeping God. He loves his people. He is patient. He is steadfast. And so, as we're thinking about the fact that Saul is failing, and yes, we see this direct correlation or this direct contrast between he and Jonathan. Also think about the contrast between Saul and Yahweh, the king they rejected, who never fails his people and never slips up, who never makes a hasty choice that's not wise or unthought through. Well, as we begin in our first point in verse 24, we discover that this happy note we left off on in verse 23 last week is tainted by this oath that Saul makes and lays upon his people. He calls for a curse to be placed on anyone in his military who eats food before the evening comes. Now, we don't know exactly why Saul does this. The text doesn't tell us why he would make this oath and place it upon the people. It could be that the curse would keep the men from deviating from their mission in order to pillage for food, right? He wanted the Philistines destroyed, and he wanted them destroyed now. And so if he puts this oath upon them, then it'll keep them from going and pillaging to get food for themselves. Or, which I think is more likely, it could be a religious ritual of sorts, right? Wherein Saul hoped to incite the favor of God and their conflict against the Philistines through a temporary fast, denying themselves in that way, somehow inciting the favor of God. I think that's probably what's going on here. We don't know for sure, but we see other examples of Saul operating with what I call empty religion and leading up to the end of the events we see in this chapter. So I think it's probably a religious ritual of sorts, a fast, something where somehow Saul thinks that they're going to get God's attention if they will limit themselves in this way. Now look with me at verses 25 and 26 in this vow. They fear the vow, and so they don't end up eating this honey that's on the ground in the forest. They enter this forest, they see this honey, but they fear the oath that's been placed on them by Saul. So they refrain from eating, even when they see it there. They discipline themselves, they say no. But in verse 27, Jonathan arrives. And for Jonathan, it's a different story. Because Jonathan didn't hear the oath. He wasn't there. He wasn't part, for whatever reason, he wasn't around. Maybe he was still with the armor bearer and they were still doing their thing with the Philistines. We don't know. But he comes back. He didn't hear the charge from his father. And so he sees the honey. He takes his staff. He dips it into the honeycomb and he takes it in his hand. And once he puts the honey on his mouth, on his tongue, his eyes brighten, which probably indicates that some kind of physical vitality returned to him by tasting the honey. After Jonathan eats, then he's informed of the curse. Right? He's told about the oath after he gets done eating. One of Saul's men informs Jonathan of this oath, and Jonathan's response indicts his father. Okay, look with me there at verse 29. Then Jonathan said, "My father has troubled the land. See how my eyes have become bright because I tasted a little of his honey?" But this first sentence is important. My father has troubled the land. That word troubled, that Hebrew word, shows up in a place in the book of Joshua that you may remember. I want you to turn with me to Joshua chapter 6 and chapter 7. Let's go back a few books. Back before Ruth, back before Judges, into Joshua chapter 6. That word, that Hebrew word for trouble, shows up here in a sobering story. In chapter 6, we see the fall of Jericho. Right? The last day when the people of Israel are charged to march around the city, the walls fall down. This is what we read in verse 18. Look with me there at chapter 6. But you, keep yourselves from the things devoted to destruction, lest when you have devoted them, you take any of the devoted things and make the camp of Israel a thing for destruction and bring trouble upon it. Whenever you go in and you siege Jericho, don't take these things devoted for destruction and take them for yourself. Right? And don't do that. Why? So that you won't bring trouble upon the camp of Israel. That word trouble, same Hebrew word as we saw back there whenever Jonathan's speaking of his father and says he's brought trouble upon the land. Okay? Now look with me at chapter 7. We know what happens here. Chapter 7, verse 1, but the people of Israel broke faith in regard to the devoted things, for Achan, the son of Carmi, son of Zabdi, son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, took some of the devoted things, and the anger of the Lord burned against the people of Israel. Okay, so he's stolen these devoted things. Okay, it was already promised that that trouble would come, right? If this happened and Achan did it, trouble comes. And we find out in chapter 7 that 36 of God's people are killed by the people in Ai, the next city-state that they're sieging. And then they find out what the problem is. Look with me in verses 25 and 26. They find out Achan's the problem. He kept some of these things devoted for destruction. He kept them for himself. And we see in verse 25, and Joshua said, "Why did you bring trouble on us? The Lord brings trouble on you today." And all Israel stoned him, Achan, with stones, and they burned them with fire and stoned them with stones. So this trouble that had been brought upon the people of Israel is similar to the trouble that Jonathan is accusing or indicting his father with. This is the same kind of trouble that Saul is bringing upon the people, is what Jonathan is saying. Now, what's important for us to remember about this is that there are consequences that come along with this. And I want you to see that in our next point. The consequences of Saul's choice. Look with me starting in verse 30 of our text. He says that his father has brought trouble upon the land. Verse 30 says, "How much better if the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies that they found. For now the defeat among the Philistines has not been great." What's Jonathan saying? He's saying that for the people of Israel, if they would have had sustenance, if Saul would have allowed them to eat, then the defeat that they had been given would have been greater. Right? If the people would have had the energy that comes with eating food, then it would have been better off. Their victory would have been even greater if they would have been allowed to have what they needed in order to fight well. See, Saul's decision lacked wisdom. It was rash. It was impulsive. It was foolish. Why would you call for a fast in the middle of a battle when you know your men need their strength in order to do what they got to do? It would have been better, Jonathan says. We see that as the first consequence here. Saul's choice led to a lesser victory. It would have been better had they eaten, and the defeat would have been greater. But that's not the only consequence of Saul's actions. In verse 31, if you want to look with me there, it seems that now it's probably after the designated time given in the oath, right? That time that the fast is over now. And so they struck down the Philistines that day from Michmash to Aijalon. And the people were very faint. What did they do? After they defeated the Philistines, this wording is picturesque. The people pounced on the spoil. They pounced on the spoil and took the sheep and oxen and calves and slaughtered them on the ground, and the people ate them with the blood. They're so ravenous, they're so hungry for not eating that they kill these animals and they don't even slaughter them correctly. They don't even drain them of the blood. They just eat the animals because they're so incredibly hungry. And what is the problem with that? The problem with that is they're sinning against God. And it's made very clear in the text here, right? When they go tell Saul, "Behold, the people are sinning against the Lord by eating with the blood." That was a violation of the Mosaic law to eat the blood of an animal. That was to be sacrificed, right? And so you had to drain the blood. You weren't to eat the animal with the blood. They violated the law of Moses. And it's really easy to just stay focused on them. Okay, yes, they're sinning against the Lord. That, no doubt about that. They are responsible people. They made a choice. They sinned against God. But what led to that choice? What led to them being so hungry that they made that choice? What provoked them? Was it not this curse? Was it not this oath that Saul laid upon them? His choice not only led to a lesser victory, but it also provoked or led the people towards sinning against God because they were so very hungry. And we see in these verses 30 through 35, after Saul hears about it, he recognizes that he needs to do something about it. He tried to remedy the situation, right? He tries to make things right with regard to the people's sin by calling them to bring up the oxen. He charges them not to eat the blood. And verse 35 tells us that he built an altar to the Lord. And the next phrase is interesting. It was the first altar that he built to the Lord, we're told. The first altar he built to the Lord. Why would the author say that? Why would he make that point? Well, I think it's a negative connotation. I think that's what we're getting here. There's a negative connotation to this phrase, suggesting that Saul was not a devout man of God. Saul wasn't a devout man of faith. He has been a king for some time, but this is the first time he's built an altar for the Lord. Just now. I mean, he's already lost his lineage, his monarchy, right? We saw that back in chapter 13. Because of his sin against God, his disobedience against God, God says, you aren't going to have a son to sit on the throne. You're not going to have a lineage of kings that comes after you and your family. It ends with you, and there's somebody else that's going to be taking the throne. And this has already happened. And, I mean, just now, he's building an altar to the Lord. It seems that there's a lack of holiness, that there's a lack of faith, a lack of spiritual vitality and devotion that he has. Something that I think we also see here is that there's no remorse with regard to Saul. There's not a hint of Saul recognizing the error of his foolish leadership. No, there's not a hint of him seeing, oh yeah, you know what? It wasn't a good idea for me to pronounce that oath. The people probably wouldn't have been so hungry that they sinned against the Lord if I wouldn't have done something so foolish. You don't see any recognition of this. No recognition of fault on his part. The people were guilty, yes, but they were guilty being provoked by their king. But there's no sorrow over this. No recognition that he's done anything wrong. You see what we're doing, what we've seen, not just this evening, but time after time again, is stacking up all of these reasons why Saul is not the man for the job, right? This king that you wanted, this king that you rejected God for, this human king that looked the part, right? He's not the man for the job. He's the man with the job. He's not the man for the job. It's God's discipline, is it not? Here's your king. Here's what you wanted. You're feeling it now. But in our last point, and this is where I think we get most of our help and application from, is that we see a contrast here. In verses 36 through 46, there's a contrast that I want to draw your attention to, and it spans other parts of the chapter as well. But Saul, in verse 36, he wants to go and plunder the Philistines. He wants to go plunder them by night all the way until the morning. And the people do give approval, but the priest, they don't give him his name here in this chapter. It's probably Ahijah from earlier in the chapter. Ahijah wants to draw near to God. So what does Saul do? He inquires of the Lord, it tells us. Verse 37, and Saul inquired of God, shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you give them into the hand of Israel? But he did not answer him that day. God is silent. He doesn't give Saul an answer. So what do you think that Saul does at this point? He figures, okay, there must be some sin. There must be some sin in the people of Israel. There's got to be a reason why God's not answering us, why he's silent here. So there's got to be something going on in the camp. There's got to be something going on among the people, some sin that's keeping God from answering us. And so he gathers the leaders, and he seeks what sin among the people has led to this non-answer. In doing this, he utters another rash vow. Look with me in verse 39. Here's another rash vow. This is vow oath language, okay? For as the Lord lives, who saves Israel. That's vow language. Though it be in Jonathan my son, he shall surely die. So if Jonathan's the one that's guilty of the sin that's keeping God from giving his answer, then even if it's my son, he shall surely die. He's reckless. In his recklessness, he's even willing that his son be put to death if he be guilty of the sin that's keeping God from answering. And so, in verses 40 through 42, you see here the Urim and the Thummim. I think that's how you pronounce it. Probably need to go look that up. But these are probably used for decision making, much like casting lots. So they're trying to find out where is the guilt in the people. Who's it with? Is it with the people of Israel? Is it with Jonathan? Is it with Saul? And so there's a separation. Then Saul and Jonathan are chosen, and then Jonathan is chosen. The guilt is with him. And so in verse 43, Saul said to Jonathan, "Tell me what you have done." And Jonathan told him, "I tasted a little honey with the tip of the staff that was in my hand. Here I am. I will die." Jonathan is exposed, and Jonathan tells his father about the incident with the honey. And verses 44 and 45, Jonathan or Saul, in his impulsivity, again, his rashness, calls for his son's death. But what happens? The people intervene for Jonathan and save his life. It says, I love this, verse 45, so the people ransomed Jonathan so that he did not die. They stand up for him. They can't see the sense of putting to death this man that God had used to save them just earlier. I mean, just the day before, I think. This man that God used to defeat the Philistines, I mean, God used him. Why would we want to put him to death? Doesn't that say something? And so, these strong words in verse 45, shall Jonathan die who has worked this great salvation in Israel? Far from it. As the Lord lives, there shall not one hair of his head fall to the ground. And so, Jonathan lives. But we see this contrast. Contrast in chapter 14 between Saul and Jonathan. And I just want to kind of give you these contrasts that we see one after another. All right? And then let's draw home some application. Contrast between Saul and Jonathan. First of all, we see Saul's inactivity. We said this earlier in the sermon. We see Saul's inactivity and his idleness there in the cave, not doing anything about the problem with the people, with the Philistines. The Philistines are coming toward them in battle. They come to the pass of Michmash, we're told, at the end of chapter 13. What's Saul doing? Sitting in a cave. The impossibility of the situation. They didn't have swords. They didn't have spears. Right? There are only 600 people at that time, and Saul's not doing anything about it. But then we see Jonathan's act of courage. Right? His act of courage, it may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few. And then they have this little test that they give to the Lord and go up, and God uses them to defeat the Philistines. So inactive idleness and then active courage. That's the contrast we see. But we also see Saul's foolish, impulsive vow, and then we see Jonathan's wisdom. Okay? The impulsive vow that Saul gives, somehow probably trying to incite the favor of God. But then Jonathan's wisdom, I think Jonathan sees it right here. His father has brought trouble upon Israel. It would have been better if you would have given the honey, let the people eat, or let them eat anything so they can have vitality physically so they can go and fight and do what they need to do as the military. So Jonathan's wisdom, Saul's foolishness. Then we also see Saul's refusal to own up to his foolishness. His refusal to say anything about his fault or his error. He's silent about it. But then, did we not see Jonathan's quickness in revealing that he ate the honey? And even though he did it in innocence, he says, I did it. You know, he offers that information very quickly. Tell me what you have done, verse 43. And Jonathan told him, I tasted a little honey with the tip of the staff that was in my hand. He doesn't hold back. He offers it up. So you see that contrast too. Then we also see Saul's empty religion and Jonathan's faith. And Saul's seems to be operating with these empty choices of religion, whether it be the fast. It may be that this altar that he's making is kind of too little too late. He hasn't been doing this all along. And then he only seeks the Lord after the priest tells him it's a good idea. But we see this faith coming from Jonathan, and this trust in Yahweh, who can save by many or by few. And he trusts the Lord, and that's what leads to his act of courage. And then we also see at the end, although Saul is the king, I mean, he's their king, who supports Jonathan in the end? It's the people. The people support Jonathan in the end. They go against their king. The king is the one calling for the death of Jonathan, his own son. But yet the people are saying, no, a hair from his head is not going to fall to the ground. So the people are not with Saul, their king. They're with Jonathan, his son. And so Jonathan, in contrast, has the support of the people when Saul doesn't. What's interesting is this. I love this. If you don't read Dale Ralph Davis in his commentaries, you need to, but he always makes a good point, a good application point for us to consider in these texts. You see Jonathan, and he's the guy that you wish were king, right? I mean, you look at him, and every step of the way, you're like, man, Jonathan, he's the guy that should be on the throne. Why isn't Jonathan on the throne? Look at all these decisions. Look at these contrasts. He's kingly material. The monarchy should belong to this guy. But it's not. It belongs to Saul. It belongs to his dad. And yet, we see Jonathan's never going to be on the throne. Why is that? Chapter 13 told us that Saul, his lineage ends with him, right? He's not going to have there's not going to be another king on the throne that's in the line of Saul. David's going to start up next. The one who's after, the one after God's own heart, God says. And so, you look at Saul and you think, oh, well, when Saul dies, then Jonathan will be on the throne. Not so, because God ended that already. So this guy who really you wish were the king, the guy doing things right, he's never going to sit on the throne. Are we okay with that? Are we okay with that? That's God's choice. I mean, do we believe in a sovereign God? We do, don't we? We believe he's in charge. Are we okay with that? And we need to be okay with that, because Saul being given to the people is him saying, you rejected me, here's your king. There's discipline in this, isn't there? There's discipline in this. And so when they're being disciplined, they need to trust God. I mean, the people of Israel are seeing this. They see Jonathan. They stand up for Jonathan. They're seeing this contrast. And yet, we need to trust God. They need to trust God. We need to trust God in the midst of our discipline, when we wish things were a different way, when we think, man, things would be so much better if they were this way. But you know what? God gives us what we need sometimes, and what we need is to see our sin, to feel the weight of it, to be disciplined by God, and to trust him in that, even when we see the alternative is right there and wouldn't it be so much better? Do we trust him even when we see that something we think would be so much better? Do we trust him when we know we need what he's giving us? When it hurts, when it's teaching us, when it's obvious that we've got to repent. See, Saul is making us thirst for another king, is he not? As we're walking through this, kind of makes us hungry. What's our appetite for another king, a better king, a good king, a trustworthy king, a faithful king, a king that's after God's own heart? David is a king after God's own heart. And so when we get to David, we kind of have that appetite. We kind of get filled up a little bit. Our thirst is quenched when we see David. Okay, here's the guy. Here's the guy we're waiting for. The guy that Saul wasn't, right? The Jonathan could have been, right? But Saul wasn't. But then if we keep going, if we think big picture, what happens with David? Does he fall? He falls too. He commits sin with Bathsheba. The sword comes upon his house. God, even though he is a man after God's own heart, he makes this huge error, this huge sin, this wicked thing. Nathan the prophet says, you have despised the word of the Lord and you've despised the Lord by sinning against God with Bathsheba and committing adultery and then murder with her husband. And so we get to that part, you're like, wow, this isn't the one I'm looking for. I'm still hungry for something better in a king. And that points forward to what? That helps us look forward. Well, it's not going to be Solomon, we know that. Rehoboam, it's not going to be him either, right? The kingdom splits. He wasn't wise. What about Manasseh? No, not him. He was evil. Ahab? No. All these other kings? What about these guys? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Not even the good ones. Because they live, they rule, they die. But there's a king that will sit on the throne of his father David, we're told in the New Testament. And he is God. His rule will be forever. And you've got to love what we see. And I know I point back to this time and time again, but we need to see it again. In Luke chapter 1, whenever Gabriel's talking to Mary, he says, he will be great, speaking of Jesus. He will be called the Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give to him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever. And his kingdom, of his kingdom, there will be no end. God will rule. God in the flesh, Jesus Christ. He will have no end to his kingdom. And so when we get to Jesus, all of our yearnings and our thirsts and our appetite for the king that we were hoping all of these would be, it's satisfied. And we'll never look for another king beyond him, because there is no better king. There is no one who can fulfill the longings that we have. We are made for him. We are made for this king. We're made to bow the knee to this king. We're made to serve this king. And he is good in every meaning of the word, and will rule us with faithfulness and steadfast love. We don't have to keep looking. We get to Jesus, we get to New Testament. There's no one beyond him. Let us rest and be satisfied in our King. Let's pray.